The room was thick with anticipation. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and political aides shuffled nervously in the background. It was supposed to be a standard press conference, one of those events where politicians traded polite jabs and discussed policy. But today was different. Today, John Kennedy, the United States Senator from Louisiana, was about to face off with Kamala Harris, and the stakes had never been higher. The crowd fell silent as Harris took the stage. Her confident stride and commanding presence instantly commanded the attention of the room. She had that ability, the kind that made her seem untouchable. The room buzzed with energy as she began her address, speaking with the practiced ease of a seasoned politician. But then, as she paused for a moment to catch her breath, her eyes flicked toward Kennedy. She smiled, but there was something cold behind that smile. "Sit down, boy," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a hot knife. The words hung in the air, sharp and biting. The room collectively gasped. Was she joking? Was this just political banter, or was there something deeper beneath the surface? John Kennedy's face froze for a brief moment. The room waited in suspense as his eyes locked with Kamala's. He was known for his southern charm and humor, but this wasn't a moment for jokes. Kamala had pushed him, and now it was his turn to respond. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every inch of his reaction. The world was watching. For a split second, Kennedy seemed to hesitate. Was he going to take the bait? Was he going to retreat, let the insult slide, and move on with the speech? His reputation, his career, his pride, all on the line. But then, something changed. A small smile crept across Kennedy's face, a smile that said it all. He wasn't backing down. The crowd held its breath, and then Kennedy spoke. "Sit down, boy. You may think you've won this one, Kamala, but you just woke up a sleeping giant." Kamala's words had stung, but the truth was this wasn't the first time John Kennedy had faced down disrespect. In fact, it was a part of his life he rarely talked about in public. Behind the senator's polished exterior, his sharp wit, and his reputation as a political powerhouse, there was a history, one that few knew about. As a young man, John had been an underdog in every sense of the word. Born and raised in Zachary, Louisiana, a small town where few ever left, Kennedy grew up in a world where dreams were often whispered in the dark, and ambition was seen as a dangerous pursuit. His family was neither rich nor well-connected. They were hard-working, humble people, trying to make ends meet in a world that rarely offered them a seat at the table. John's father, a mechanic, had always said, "Son, you're going to have to fight for everything you get." And fight he did. From a young age, he was driven, determined to escape the confines of his small-town life. But it wasn't easy. He had spent years studying law in a small, overcrowded classroom at Louisiana State University. His only companions were his textbooks, determination, and the haunting feeling of not fitting in. While other students had the luxury of rich family legacies and political connections, John had only his grit to rely on. But he was relentless, making a name for himself through hard work and a reputation for sticking up for the underdog. It was the start of something big, but it didn't come without its challenges. When he moved to Washington, the halls of the Capitol were a far cry from the dusty roads of Baton Rouge. But even in the Senate, Kennedy was no stranger to the feeling of being the outsider. His thick Louisiana accent often turned heads. His blunt, no-nonsense style didn't always sit well with his more polished colleagues, who preferred diplomacy over directness. And then, of course, there was Kamala Harris. Kennedy had always respected her. She was ambitious, smart, and an undeniable force in American politics. But he knew that her rise to power had come with its own set of challenges. Challenges that John could relate to all too well. He had always admired Kamala's ability to speak her mind and command the room. But as their careers had evolved, their paths had begun to cross more often, especially during the turbulent times in Washington where power struggles were more common than friendship. But there was one thing that John never expected from her: the public insult. It stung more than he cared to admit. After all, he wasn't just a senator to Kamala. He was an older figure, one who had fought in the trenches long before her political career had gained steam. She knew how hard he had fought, how many sacrifices he had made to reach the heights he'd achieved. But somehow she saw him as a threat, someone who had to be put in his place. And in that moment, in front of the cameras and the audience, she had done just that. As John stood there, Recalling those early days when he was told he wouldn't amount to anything, he realized how far he had come. The disrespect he'd faced in his youth had never deterred him. It had only made him stronger. So why should this be any different? There was no time for regret. No time for second-guessing. Kennedy understood that the battle wasn't about what had been said in that room. It was about what he was going to do next. This wasn't just another politician's spat. This was about proving to Kamala Harris, the world, and most importantly himself, that he wasn't just a relic of the past, he was still very much in the game. And the game was about to get a lot more interesting. The room seemed to hold its breath as Kamala's words lingered in the air. "Sit down, boy." The echo of her voice bounced off the walls, leaving a palpable tension that wrapped around everyone present. For a moment, it seemed like the world had stopped turning. No one moved. No one spoke. John Kennedy stood still, his back straight, eyes locked on Kamala. The man who had faced down fierce political battles, fought to pass legislation that would change lives, now stood vulnerable in front of the most powerful woman in America, his dignity at stake. Was this the moment that would define him? Would he allow her words to break him? Or would he respond in a way that would leave his mark on history? Kamala's gaze didn't waver. She held the mic with an air of dominance. A woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to assert it. She had built her career on being tough, on making the difficult decisions, and on never backing down. But John Kennedy wasn't the type to back down either. Not anymore. He could feel the pressure mounting, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. The room was filled with a strange energy, like the calm before a storm. The eyes of the press, the aides, even the cameras all turned to him. He knew this was his moment. The world would soon be watching his every move, waiting for his reaction. This wasn't just about political strategy anymore. This was about his integrity, his honor. He could have snapped back, said something biting in return, played the same game of power that Kamala had initiated. He could have done that. He had the quick wit, the political acumen to deliver 1,000 clever retorts. But this wasn't just about winning in the moment. This was about winning the long game. The weight of his past, his family, his community, the underdog stories that had shaped his path, all pressed down on him. He was no stranger to insults and slights. He had spent years proving people wrong. But now was different. For the first time in his career, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and instead of reacting with rage, he chose something else. Silence. It was a silence that stretched on for what seemed like an eternity, as if the universe itself had paused. And in that silence, John Kennedy took a single step forward. He reached for the mic, his hand steady, his posture commanding yet calm. He didn't flinch. The tension in the room cracked like thunder. The air thickened as he finally spoke, his voice soft but undeniably powerful. "Sit down, boy. You just made the mistake of thinking I'm still playing that game." The words were slow, deliberate, every syllable measured as if each one carried the weight of his entire life story. He could feel the eyes on him, could hear the subtle gasps from the crowd. This wasn't the reaction anyone had expected, but it was the right reaction. "You've come to me in this moment thinking I'm just a boy who will sit down when you tell me to," Kennedy continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "But let me remind you of something, Kamala. I've been underestimated my whole life, and I've spent every second proving the world wrong." His words hung in the air, a direct challenge to Kamala's authority, but in the most unexpected way. This wasn't the outburst people were expecting. This wasn't a fight for dominance, and this was a fight for respect, a fight for identity. A fight to remind the world that Kennedy was no longer the boy he used to be. Kamala's smile faded just for a moment. It was subtle, but it was there. She had made a powerful woman's mistake. She had underestimated him, and in doing so, she had made him stronger. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the reporters whispering in hushed tones as they processed what had just unfolded. Kamala remained poised, but her eyes betrayed her thoughts. Kennedy had turned her insult into a masterstroke of political strategy. He had made it clear, this was no longer a game for children. John Kennedy turned toward the cameras, his expression calm but resolute. "I don't need to stoop to your level, Kamala. You've already made the mistake of thinking you can break me. But the truth is, it's not me who needs to sit down. It's you." The statement wasn't just directed at Kamala. It was directed at the political world that had watched him rise from humble beginnings. From the boy who had once been too quiet, too unpolished, to the man who was now standing taller than ever. He wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. "Sit down, boy," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying with it a sense of finality. "I think it's time we both stand up." The silence that followed was deafening. Kamala's lips parted, but she didn't say another word. She couldn't. She had been caught off guard, and now Kennedy had the world on his side. The room was in an uproar, the tension snapping like a rubber band stretched too tight. People stood, phones recording, whispers filling the air. They had just witnessed a political turnaround, a moment of power. Kamala Harris, for all her strength, had just met the one person who would not back down. And America was watching. The room was electric with tension as John Kennedy's words hung in the air. Kamala Harris, ever the seasoned politician, held her ground. But something had shifted. The balance of power had tilted ever so slightly in Kennedy's favor, and the crowd knew it. Whispers spread like wildfire. This wasn't just another political exchange. This was a battle of wills, one that could define both their careers. Kennedy had proven in that moment that he was no longer the underdog. He was here to stay, and nothing, not even the vice president, would push him around. But as the cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes, Kennedy knew something even more profound was at play. His response wasn't just about winning the debate. It was about changing the narrative, and for that he had to reveal something more than just words. For the first time in his political career, he felt an overwhelming urge to speak the truth. The truth that no one knew. The truth about who he really was, beyond the Senate, beyond the polished speeches and perfect public image. The truth that had been buried deep inside him for years. It wasn't just about pride anymore. It wasn't about winning a political argument. It was about showing the world who John Kennedy truly was. Kamala tried to recover, adjusting her stance, clearing her throat. But the damage had already been done. Kennedy had taken the first step in revealing a side of himself that no one in the political sphere had ever seen. His calmness, his dignity in the face of insult, was a side of him that had been buried for far too long. And now it was time to show the world the man behind the politician. Kennedy stepped forward again, this time his voice a little softer, more intimate, as if he was speaking not to the audience but to Kamala herself. "Kamala, you think that because I'm from Louisiana, because I'm older, because I've been in politics longer, that I don't know how the game is played. But you're wrong. I've been underestimated by the best of them," he said, his voice steady, but with a subtle edge. "But here's the thing you don't understand about me. You don't understand the strength that comes from being the one everyone overlooks. The one everyone thinks is too small to matter. You see, Kamala, I've spent my life fighting for those who have no voice, for the ones who have been shut out of the system, and that's why I can stand here and tell you that I'm not going anywhere." Kamala's eyes narrowed. There it was, the hint of something deeper, the unspoken truth that had always been buried beneath the surface. The public had always known. Kennedy as the polished politician with the Southern charm, the funny quips, the easy jokes. But they didn't know his true power, the power that had been forged in the fires of hardship, struggle, and rejection. Kennedy continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've walked through more doors that were closed in my face than you could ever imagine. I've faced down more insults than you can count. But here's the thing, Kamala. The more you try to put me in a box, the more you try to define me by what you think I am, the more you miss the point. Because the truth is, I am more than you think." For a moment, Kamala's usual composure faltered. She hadn't expected this. She thought she had Kennedy pegged, thought he was just another politician trying to hold on to power with charm and wit. But she had misjudged him, miserably. The press room was now a silent spectator to this unexpected exchange. Reporters shifted in their seats, murmuring to each other. Kennedy's words had cut deeper than anyone had expected. They weren't just words of defense, but words of revelation. A revelation that came from a place that Kamala hadn't anticipated. Kamala was caught off guard. This was no longer about politics. This was personal. The air between them was charged with an intensity that neither could escape. In a way, it felt like both of them were fighting for their legacy, fighting for their place in history. Kamala, with her years of political experience and power, and Kennedy with his underdog resilience and hidden strength. Kamala's response was cool, but there was a flicker of something else behind her eyes. Respect. Not just for his words, but for the man standing before her. "I never thought you'd be the one to surprise me, John," she said, her voice softer now, almost as if she were acknowledging the shift in the room. "But you've done it." And then, just as quickly, she added with a smirk, "But don't think this is over. You've started something now, and I'll finish it." Kennedy smiled, but it wasn't the usual charming grin. It was a knowing smile, a smile that said everything without saying anything at all. He had made his point. And now, it was time for the world to decide what they thought of him. He looked directly into the camera, as if speaking not just to Kamala but to the entire nation. "You've seen me now, Kamala," he said, "but the world is just beginning to see who I really am." The cameras clicked and buzzed, the air thick with the realization that this was only the beginning of something far larger than either of them had anticipated. The days following the confrontation were like a fever dream. The media went into overdrive, churning out opinions, headlines, and analyses about the public exchange between Kamala Harris and John Kennedy. The nation, split in its opinions of who had won, couldn't stop talking about the moment Kennedy had turned the tables, standing his ground with an unshakable calm. But for John Kennedy, the battle wasn't over. What had happened in that press room had awakened something deeper within him, something he hadn't acknowledged for years. The quiet, resolute part of him that had survived years of dismissal, of being looked over and dismissed by both sides of the aisle, had come to life again. The boy who had once felt like an outsider in his own country was no longer silent. Kennedy didn't sleep much the night after the confrontation. He sat in the dim light of his office, papers scattered before him, his thoughts spiraling around the events of the past few days. He thought about his past, about growing up in Louisiana with a chip on his shoulder, always trying to prove he was worthy of respect. He thought about his family, about his father's voice echoing in his head. "You're gonna have to fight for everything, son." Kennedy had never been afraid of a fight, but this time it felt different. The battle he was in wasn't just for political power or public acclaim. It was a battle for something more personal, a battle for authenticity, for his right to exist in a world that had always tried to put him in a box, to define him by his accent, his roots, and his past. Kamala had tried to reduce him to a stereotype, the old out-of-touch politician who didn't belong in the modern world. But the truth was, John Kennedy had always belonged. He had earned his seat at the table, and now, more than ever, he was ready to claim his place. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began slowly, in the quiet moments, when Kennedy looked at himself in the mirror and finally saw the man he had worked his entire life to become. He was no longer the boy who had been dismissed. He was the man who would no longer allow anyone to define him by the limitations they imposed on him. Over the next few weeks, Kennedy took his political strategy to a whole new level. He began speaking out more boldly, not just on the issues he had always championed, but on a personal level. He talked about the struggles of his youth, about the grit it had taken to get where he was. He spoke with a newfound confidence, a confidence that came from knowing that the world would never see him as weak again. Kamala's words still stung, but they no longer had the power they once did. In fact, they had only empowered him. The moment she had tried to reduce him to a boy, he had become a man. Kennedy's rise to power wasn't just about political victories anymore. It was about standing in his own truth. He didn't have to apologize for who he was or where he came from. And more importantly, he didn't have to be afraid of the bullies, whether they were in the Senate, on the streets, or in the media. And then came the public speech. It was at a press conference for a new legislative initiative that Kennedy took the stage, not just as a senator, but as someone who had finally claimed his place in the political world. He stepped up to the mic, eyes focused, not just on the crowd, but on the truth he was about to speak. I've spent my life fighting for those who are overlooked, for those who are underestimated, he began. His voice was steady, but there was a steel in it now. I've been called names. I've been told I don't belong. But I'm here to tell you today I belong here. I'm not just a politician. I am a man who has earned his seat, and I will fight for those who have no voice. I will fight for those who are treated as lesser, and no one will ever make me feel small again. The crowd sat in stunned silence, absorbing every word. The political commentators who had once dismissed him were now taking notes. The press, who had branded him as a relic of the past, was now hanging on his every word. John Kennedy had found his voice, and it was louder than ever. The transformation wasn't just visible in his speeches. It was in the way he carried himself, the way he responded to criticism, the way he challenged power without fear. Kennedy wasn't the same man who had been challenged by Kamala in that press room. He was now a man who knew his worth and was ready to prove it. The people who had once called him out as an old politician, past his prime, were now questioning their assumptions. The tides had turned. Kamala Harris, for all her power, had awakened something in Kennedy that could never be put back to sleep. And now, the world was watching as John Kennedy walked into a new chapter of his life. One where he wasn't just fighting for political victories, but fighting for respect, truth, and honor. The day of the public debate arrived, and with it came the storm that would change everything. The media had been buzzing for weeks, but now the stakes were higher than ever. The world was watching, not just for the usual policy discussions, but for the final showdown between Kamala Harris and John Kennedy. It was clear that this was no longer a political discussion. The energy in the air was electric. People gathered in person, while millions more tuned in from their homes. The cameras were rolling, the reporters on edge, and the pressure was palpable. The political titans had gathered, and the nation waited with bated breath. Kamala entered first, confident and poised as always. The crowd cheered, recognizing her as the power she had become. Her reputation was solid, her speeches well rehearsed. She had the clout, the experience, and the dominance. But when John Kennedy stepped onto the stage, there was a shift in the atmosphere. There was something different about him now. He was no longer the man who had been ridiculed or underestimated. This was a new John Kennedy, a man who had reclaimed his power, his dignity, and his place in history. His step was firm, his posture straight. The usual Southern charm that made him so relatable now seemed to have a new edge. He wasn't just here to participate. He was here to win. The audience could feel it. The tension was thick, and as the debate began, there was no doubt that both Kamala and John Kennedy had something to prove. But this time, Kennedy wasn't just responding to Kamala's jabs. He wasn't just fighting for respect. He was fighting for a legacy. Kamala started strong, confidently laying out her points with the grace and effortless eloquence that had made her a household name. But Kennedy wasn't intimidated. Each of her points, each of her rebuttals was met with a calm, sharp response. He didn't need to shout or dominate the conversation. His power lay in his restraint. The way he listened intently, the way he acknowledged Kamala's points only to flip them with his own truth. He was calm, yet his words were piercing. The audience was on the edge of their seats. The political analysts in the room, who had expected him to falter, were now scribbling furiously. The shift was happening. Kennedy wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was taking command. The pivotal moment came when Kamala, in a last attempt to regain control of the debate, tried to dismiss him again. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly, and said, "John, you're just too old-fashioned for this fight. The world has changed. You can't keep up." For a brief second, the room fell silent. Kamala had gone for the jugular, trying to corner him with the same criticism that had haunted him for years. She believed it would knock him down, make him stumble. She thought it would be the moment that proved her point. But John Kennedy's reply wasn't one of defensiveness. It was a declaration. "Maybe I'm old-fashioned," he began, his voice steady, almost soothing. "But I'm not afraid to stand my ground when the future is at stake." He paused, letting the words sink in. The room was quiet, waiting for the punchline, the jab, and then it came. "You know, Kamala, you're right. I'm not as fast, as sleek, or as polished as you. But I've spent my whole life fighting for what matters. You may have all the answers, but you can't replace experience. You can't replace the grit that comes from walking through the fire, again and again." He leaned forward, eyes locking with hers. The audience, the media, and the world were all watching, waiting for her response. "And let me tell you something, Kamala," he continued, his voice hardening. "You may be good with words, but you'll never understand what it means to fight for the people who have nothing left but hope. I've fought for them my whole life, and I'll keep fighting until I have nothing left." The room erupted. The audience was on its feet, clapping, cheering, and shouting. This wasn't just a debate. This was a moment of truth. Kamala stood silent, a flash of frustration crossing her face. She had been outmaneuvered, outclassed, and outshone. Her strength had been challenged by a man who had always been dismissed. And in this moment, Kennedy had done the unthinkable. He had claimed his place. As the applause reverberated through the room, it was clear. The debate was over. Kennedy hadn't just won the argument. He had reclaimed his legacy and shown the world who he really was. The debate ended, but the ripple effects were just beginning to reverberate. Across the nation, people were still talking about the showdown between Kamala Harris and John Kennedy. The footage from that day was everywhere. TV screens, social media feeds, news outlets, and the reactions were mixed. But one thing was certain: John Kennedy had taken control of the conversation, and the world was listening. In the aftermath, Kamala's camp tried to play it down, dismissing the exchange as nothing more than a momentary slip. She had brushed off Kennedy's remarks with the same cold confidence that had propelled her political career. But the truth was, something inside her had shifted as well. The moment she had tried to put Kennedy in his place had revealed not just his strength, but her own vulnerability. Kamala was a politician who had weathered storm after storm, yet here was a man who had outmaneuvered her with nothing more than calm conviction. And for the first time, Kamala Harris realized that sometimes the quietest person in the room was the one who had the most to say. Kennedy's victory wasn't just political, it was personal. He had won his battle, but the real transformation had taken place inside of him. He wasn't just the boy from Louisiana who had been underestimated for years. He had shown the world that age, experience, and grit had the power to silence even the loudest critics. The boy who had once been dismissed had now become a man of power, not just in politics, but in the hearts and minds of the American people. The media frenzy continued for days. Polls showed Kennedy's approval rating soaring. His response had not only earned him the respect of those who had doubted him, but also the admiration of people across the country who saw him as the underdog who had finally fought back. He was no longer just a figurehead in the Senate. He had become a symbol of resilience. His words had resonated with people who had been quietly fighting their own battles, those who had been overlooked, undervalued, and told they didn't belong. In the weeks that followed, Kennedy began to speak more candidly in public. His speeches were no longer just about policy or political strategy. They were about human connection, about fighting for the forgotten voices. He spoke with a new vulnerability, acknowledging the struggles he had faced and the strength he had found through them. He wasn't just talking about laws and bills anymore. He was talking about life, about the human experience that had shaped him into the man he had become. The final moment came at the National Press Club, when Kennedy was asked about the debate with Kamala. The reporters were eager for him to gloat, to claim victory, to bask in the praise. But Kennedy, as always, surprised them with his response. "No, I don't think I won," he said with a smile, looking directly into the camera. "What happened that day wasn't about me or Kamala. It was about something much bigger. It was about every person out there who has been told they can't do something because of where they come from, because of who they are, or because of how they speak. It was about showing them that they matter." He paused for a moment, the room quiet, the weight of his words settling in. "I didn't answer Kamala's challenge because I wanted to win a debate. I answered it because I wanted to show the world that no matter how many times you get knocked down, you can always get back up." The room sat in stunned silence before the applause began, slow at first, but growing louder with every second. John Kennedy had not just won the debate, he had changed the narrative. He had proven that the real fight wasn't about power, position, or popularity. It was about truth, integrity, and resilience. It was about being able to stand tall, even when the world tries to knock you down. As the crowd erupted in applause, Kennedy's eyes caught Kamala's across the room. She was watching him, a flicker of something unspoken in her gaze. For a moment, it seemed like she was seeing him in a new light, and maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand. But as the cheers continued, Kennedy knew the real victory wasn't in the applause or the praise. It was in the way people were now looking at him, not as the politician from Louisiana, but as the man who had defied expectations and reminded everyone that true power wasn't about how loud you were, but about how deeply you could touch the hearts of others. And as the crowd cheered, he whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning."